Yo, what is up guys, your boy IzuKage here with the movie for what if Deku had Garous abilities. So you guys really enjoyed this one, so I'm here to put it into a movie. So sit back, relax, and let's get right into the what if.
Talk to me next. Look, dirty, brilliant. Big body Benz, I got you. Scope on the kick, get in here like a Mac. I can't fuck with these hoes, these bitches is true. I'm married to bitches, got niggas attack.
Izuku in this, his story is quite similar to canon and his life has been unchanged. Izuku gets bullied for not having a quirk and even the doctors told him he would never have one. But Izuku's dad is still around, but not for long. So Izuku is at home and he's playing around with his All Might action figure. He has Edge Shot also and Endeavor. But when his dad comes home from work, Izuku, being 5 years old, he shouts out happy and goes and hugs Hiyashi, and Inko comes and kisses him on the cheek. He picks up Izuku and says, "You want to go to the park?" And Izuku starts shouting in excitement. So Hiyashi tells Inko they'll be out for a bit, and he puts Izuku in his car seat and they start driving to the park. They make it there, but it was a bad time to be there because Bakugo was there with some of his friends. And Hiyashi was working on something from work, so he wasn't paying attention. Izuku tried hiding under the slide, but Bakugo pulled him out by the back of his shirt and said, "Didn't I tell you to stay away from the park, Deku?" Izuku tried calming Bakugo down, saying he's gonna leave, he just forgot. And Bakugo chuckles and says, "Well, I'll jog your memory," and he pushes Deku to the ground. Izuku uses this time to run back to Hiyashi, and Bakugo, seeing Izuku's dad there, they were scared, like him and his group of friends, because they see him as some form of dragon because of all the cartoons they watch. So they run off while Izuku runs to Hiyashi and he says, "Dad, I think I'm ready to go." Hiyashi looks at his clock and says, "Are you sure? We only just got here." And Izuku nods his head. So on the way back home, they are stopped at an intersection when they get the green light to go, and Hiyashi does, but he didn't see the truck barreling down the street, unable to brake, and it slams right into Hiyashi's driver door. And this sends both cars airborne, glass covering the streets, and the car was stuck between the truck and a building it smashed into. So the smoke from both vehicles began filling the air and people were screaming in horror and dialed the police, while heroes nearby tried to do whatever they can. So the truck that collided with Hiyashi's car wasn't any old truck. It was going to a quirk research facility and it was carrying radioactive material. So after blocking off the area, heroes and first responders started cutting through the car because the accident flipped it on its side and blocked all the doors. So they used a saw to cut through the roof, and after half an hour, they pulled out Hiyashi and Izuku. So they took them both to the hospital where Hiyashi was announced dead and Izuku lost his right arm and right leg. Too great an injury for any healing quirk to aid him. So Inko was at home when she got a call, and on the other line were the doctors who told Inko about the tragedy. Inko froze and the doctors asked, "Miss Midori, are you still there?" But Inko couldn't believe what she was hearing. The phone fell from her hand and tears started rolling down Inko's face. Inko quickly grabbed a jacket and started running to the hospital since they had no car. And this took at least an hour to get there. Inko asked the receptionist about her son and they led her to the room where Izuku was still on life support. The tears started again and Inko sat by Izuku's side and held his hand. She was overcome with emotions like, how could this even happen? Izuku remained in the hospital where he would awaken, but no one was in the room since Inko was at Hiyashi's funeral that day. In his bed, Izuku stretched like he just woke up. And when he looked at his arm, it was weird because his right arm was a lighter shade than his left. But Izuku didn't really think much of it, but then all the memories of the car accident and the whole truck, just everything hit him, and he held his head in pain from the influx of information. And all Izuku could think of was his dad. He got up and out of his bed with the tubes still attached to him, and he's like dragging his IV drip behind him. Izuku got into the hallway, and the first doctor he saw, he grabbed onto his coat and said, "Where's my dad?" The doctor looked confused and called for security. Soon, a bunch of people wearing vests were surrounding Izuku before his personal doctor came and injected him with a tranquilizing agent, putting him to sleep. Hours later, Izuku wakes up with his mom and doctor discussing something. They were talking about how it was possible that Izuku regrew his limbs. When they saw that he was awake, Inko came over and comforted Izuku, saying that everything was okay. After a week more in the hospital, Izuku was permitted to go home, but for the next year, he would go through physiotherapy to regain proper control of his body, like walking or even eating properly and using his right hand. So Izuku is 10 and he's been a shut-in ever since the incident. He hasn't been to school, he just stays home all day. Until Izuku came across a video of villains holding up a bank with hostages, and of course the heroes come in, they save the day, and Izuku had seen how corrupt heroes can be. After they rescue the hostages, they took interview after interview, capitalizing off innocent people, and Izuku wanted a change. Only two heroes stood out to him, All Might and Eraserhead. All Might did take interviews sometimes, but little was known about him or his quirk. That's why he admired him so much. He jumped in, saved the day, maybe tells everyone to be safe, and leaves. And Eraserhead is even better, some people don't even know he exists. So Izuku decided to do something with his life and left his room. He was sickly skinny, like I'm talking bone and skin, that's it. And he was pretty tall for his age, so he asked Inko if he could get training at a local dojo, and he had already picked it out. Inko was surprised at how much Izuku was interested, and if it meant him getting out of the house, she would take it. So she signed him up to the dojo, and the owner was this old guy and he had two pupils, Charanko and Ojiro. Izuku bowed to his new sensei Shifu. Yes, like Kung Fu Panda, I just like the name, okay? So Master Shifu wanted to test Izuku. He expected him to be pretty weak, you know, the kid is basically just sticks, and so he went full speed, dashing behind Izuku and threw a punch at him. Izuku's body moved on its own and it went to cover the back of his head where the punch was going to land. But of course, you know, Master Shifu stops before he actually hits him, and he was actually impressed at the kid's reflexes and said, "Good job, I will accept you into my class." Izuku didn't know what he did, but hey, he was accepted. So 2 years go by and Izuku has improved tremendously, becoming Shifu's best student. Izuku learned all of Shifu's martial arts technique just a week into his training, and he has a sort of natural ability to learn new things and make his opponent's fighting styles his own. So Izuku had been back to school and everyone could feel something ominous about him. He became more lean and taller than everyone else in his class. So Izuku is 12 and he's been training and wants to go all out in training today. He enters the dojo and Charanko and Ojiro are doing their usual routine, and Izuku walks up to both of them and says to Ojiro, "Fight me." You know, he's in the middle of his stretches and says, "Bro, we can spar later." But Izuku wasn't satisfied with the answer, and he swipes Ojiro's legs, knocking him off balance and falling to the ground. Ojiro though uses his tail to catch himself and he says, "What's your problem, dude?" And Izuku got into his martial arts stance and said, "Fight me." Ojiro said, "Well, you asked for it," and he swung his tail at Izuku, but he grabbed it and threw him across the dojo. Ojiro landed and dashed at Izuku, and the two started trading blows, but it was obvious Izuku had the upper hand. He put his leg in between Ojiro's and grabbed one of his punches, spun around, flipped Ojiro over his shoulder and slammed him onto the ground. Shifu, who lived below the dojo, ran upstairs hearing the commotion, and he came through the door and saw Izuku punch Ojiro in the chest, sending him flying and into the wall, and he wasn't getting up. Sharanko was in the corner scared, and as Izuku was walking towards him, Shifu steps in and says, "Why are you doing this?" Izuku says, "I'm only testing my power." And he ran past Shifu and was about to strike Sharanko when Shifu grabbed him and pushed him back. Izuku was angry and said, "So you want some then?" And he rushed Shifu. He was overpowering Izuku with ease, but Izuku was smirked and he said, "I knew you were hiding more from me." And he quickly adapted to Shifu's fighting style, using it against him and pushed him back. Shifu had no choice and used his quirk. For a second, Shifu's strength would increase immensely. The reason why he didn't become a hero with it is because of the requirement for his quirk to be really effective. The longer he doesn't use the quirk is the stronger it gets. And he can only activate the strength once a day for a few seconds, as I mentioned. And he hasn't used his quirk for years. So Shifu activated his quirk and his muscles tensed up and his veins started bulging. He disappeared from Izuku's vision, appearing behind him, and in one move struck all his weak points. Izuku's body tensed up, and for a second he couldn't feel anything, but the effects didn't last long. And when Shifu saw this, his eyes widened. How? Most people would drop just on the spot whenever he used that. So using the little time he had left, he punched Izuku max power in his chest. And this punch was like Detroit Smash but stronger, sending Izuku flying through the walls of the dojo and falling down the mountain which the building was built in the side of. So Izuku woke up hours later in a shallow river and he shook his head and he thought, who knew the old man had such a strong quirk? And he groaned as he got up, and Izuku limped his way back home, and luckily Inko was out, so he got in, showered and had some rest. Fast forward a year, and at school, Izuku made it clear he isn't someone to mess with, taking down anyone who even looks at him wrong. Even older students, Izuku doesn't discriminate, he doesn't care about your age. But Izuku had never gotten in trouble because he knows how to keep him silent. So, Izuku would spend his time learning all he can from the people around him. So we skip to the final day of school, and as Izuku is walking into school, people are making sure to step out of his way, and as he's about to enter class, he calls out Bakugo's name. Bakugo, who was trying to stay hidden, comes out and says, "Yes, Izuku?" Izuku said, "What school did you apply for?" And Bakugo said proudly, "UA." Izuku wasn't at all surprised and says, "Well, I'm applying there too. Make yourself useful and give the principal this letter." Bakugo couldn't stand being talked down to, but he complied and took it to the principal. Later that day, the teacher walks in and throws up the papers, and you know the routine, he's like, "I would pass out these papers, but I know you all want to be heroes." Everyone didn't react much, and the teacher really thought they would be more excited, but cleared his throat and continued. I see here we have two people who want to go to UA, Bakugo and Izuku. Still no reaction from the class, and the teacher just went along with the rest of his speech. And by the end of class, he just says, "I wish everyone good luck on their journey to the top." So school is out, and while Izuku is walking home, his reflexes kick in and dodges the sludge villain that tries attacking him. The sludge villain was taken aback and said, "What? Where did he go?" And Izuku was just standing right behind him and said, "You mean me?" The sludge villain quickly turned around, confused, then rushed Izuku. But he saw its weakness, its eyes. Izuku dashed towards the villain and stabbed his fingers into his eyes, causing the villain to become blind. The sludge villain roamed around clueless about where he was and just went into a main street where All Might saw him and landed. He threw a Detroit Smash and took the sludge villain down and continued to put it in a bottle, Izuku stayed hidden but watched All Might, and seeing him in person, it was pretty underwhelming. All Might really has no skill, he's just strong. Still, Izuku had respect for All Might because he just captured the villain and left. And Izuku thought how he would fare against All Might in a fight. But he knew he would be beaten, come on, it's All Might. He's the #1 hero for a reason. So fast forward to when he gets home and Izuku says, he greets his mom and goes to his room to start planning out his training regimen for the 10-month training period. Izuku would try tapping into this strength he knew he has but rarely comes out because Izuku is quirkless, don't get it twisted, but from the radioactive material from the start of the whole series is where Izuku is starting to display some unusual abilities like incredible strength, speed, and his growth rate in battle. So Izuku begins to work on his body even more, but his room was starting to get a bit cramped, so he searched up for a place where he could be alone and train. And at the top result was a beach nearby called Dagobah Beach. It was abandoned due to people dumping their trash on the beach, but that could be used for training. You see, Izuku didn't care to help by picking up trash. Once it benefited him, he was on board. So the next day, Izuku went to the beach and like the image, it was filled with garbage. But what he didn't expect to see were people. Two people seemed to have the same idea as he did, and when he got closer, he saw that it was a tall, scrawny guy and another guy who looked younger and more fit. So Mirio saw Izuku walking up to them and told All Might, and the two started, going to him and said, "Do you need something?" And Izuku said no, he was here to train just like they were. And Mirio was excited and said, "Well, we could train together, why not?" All Might was hesitant but agreed also, and Izuku didn't have a problem with it. And while training with them is when his true colors started to show. He became more ruthless and went overboard sometimes. For instance, while sparring, Mirio faced through Izuku's punch and punched him in the face, and this made him mad. Swiftly, Izuku turned around and backhanded Mirio in the face with a closed fist when he became tangible. Izuku then jumped high into the air, and when he came down with a powerful punch, Mirio became intangible and Izuku punched the ground, creating a small crater. This worried All Might, like why was this kid taking it so far? But the fight ended with All Might stopping it soon after. So during the rest of the 10-month, Izuku worked harder than he ever did, like running full speed in water until the drag didn't affect him anymore. Izuku would just jump out of a plane without a parachute, and he would intentionally try to drown himself to see its effect on him. Izuku would just go places that no normal person would dare do, but that's what it takes to be the best. So Izuku also analyzed different heroes' fighting styles, if they were unique enough like Gran Torino, because how Gran Torino fights isn't like every hero that just punches through walls. So during this time, Bakugo also put in some work. He hated how he had to be some sort of servant to Izuku, but that's going to quickly change. So the day before the entrance exams, Izuku and Mirio decide to have a friendly spar, friendly in quotation marks. They stood across from each other and All Might said, "Fight." They went hard from the start, with Izuku hitting Mirio when he least expected it, and Mirio phasing through some of Izuku's punches. All Might was amazed at Izuku's rapid progress and thought about giving one for all to him. He seemed more capable than Mirio, to be honest, but Izuku didn't have the hero virtues he was looking for. So the fight continued, and Izuku decided the only way to beat Mirio was to outspeed him. So Izuku began dashing around randomly, like being unable to track, and Mirio would get punched and he would try turning around, figuring where it came from, but he just couldn't. And All Might the entire time was stunned. These movements were similar to his old master, Gran Torino. So Izuku came from behind Mirio and kicked him in the back so hard he flew into the water, and All Might was just amazed, like what is this kid even? But his train of thought was broken when Izuku said he's gonna get ready for his exams tomorrow, and All Might was like, "Oh yeah, sure," and watches Izuku walk off. The next day rolls around and Izuku is ready to get into UA so he could have a chance to fight stronger people. Izuku walked up to the gate and saw a familiar face, Ojiro. He walked up to him and said, "Oh, hey Ojiro." Ojiro heard the voice and chill filled his body. Ojiro turned around and said, Izuku, what are you doing here? You're no hero. And Izuku chuckled and said, I never said I was. I could care less about saving people. I just want to fight. Ojiro froze hearing this, and he didn't even realize Izuku had already left. So Izuku walked into the UA, and there he signed up and got seated at the written portion of the exams. There he didn't do incredible, but not worse than canon. He did about the same. And then he moved on to the lecture hall where President Mike began speaking about the robots. There he was seated next to Bakugo, who was fearful of Izuku because of, his previous experiences with him, but he was trying to remain straight-faced. Izuku didn't even acknowledge his existence and kept on listening to President Mike, as Ida also got embarrassed because he tried saying, he wasn't going to talk about the zero-pointer. So everyone gets assigned to their mock city, and Izuku is assigned to mock city B. In there, he sees a few people from earlier outside, like the brunette and Ida, and some other faces. So after a bit of waiting, President Mike comes over the intercom and says, there are no countdowns in a fight, go, go, go! Izuku took a deep breath and said, let's see what UA has in store. So where we last left off, Izuku was just about to start the practical portions of the exams. So as President Mike announces everyone to go, Izuku runs out, and surprising everyone around him, they thought he had some sort of speed quirk. And Ida, he was running and looked back and see Izuku over his shoulder and thought, whoa, he's pretty fast. So Izuku turns down one of the alleys and is met by two 2-point robots. So he's thinking of the best way he could approach this because they're made of metal, he can't just punch right through them. So the robots lock onto him and they start rushing towards Izuku while he jumps around on the buildings and manages to land on one. So Izuku is on the robot's shoulders and he sees a piece of metal he could rip out of its framework. So he does to sort of use it as a weapon, and the second robot comes and tries to hit him off, but Izuku dodges, but the punch it threw destroyed the robot he was on, so hey, works for me. So Izuku jumps on the arm that tried to hit him and he runs up the robot and has the sheet of metal behind him and throws it into its head, killing that as well. So they both crash to the ground. And Izuku goes around starting ripping robots apart using his pure strength, getting into their internal components, and even when he did get hit by a robot, it barely affected him due to his just pain tolerance training and his superhuman durability. So after Izuku took down his final robot, the time runs up for the entrance exams. And while Izuku is heading back, he hears a group of people screaming. So he rushes over to see what's the commotion about. And when he gets there, he sees a group of students running past and they try warning him that it's coming. And Izuku is thinking, no, they're overreacting or something. So it starts walking to where the sounds are coming from because it's like huge footsteps or something. So he goes around a corner and sees that Uraraka is trapped under some rubble and the massive zero-pointer is coming towards her and she's screaming for help. So Izuku rushes over and starts using all of his strength to lift the piece of building off of her, and a brief struggle later he manages to get it off. Then the zero-pointer starts doing something odd. The chest of it opened, revealing its power core, and you could hear a sound of it charging up. From the observation room, Nezu and the other teachers were pressing buttons, panicking, trying to shut it down, and All Might asked, what is it doing? And Nezu said, I don't know, it seems like it has a mind of its own. So back with Izuku, he quickly hoists Uraraka into his hands and starts running. The zero-pointer started to glow and a massive beam shot out of its chest. Izuku chucked Uraraka to the side and it hit him dead on, and Izuku was shot back into the building from the plasma cannon and died. Uraraka screamed in fear and used all her strength to crawl away, and All Might and a few other hero teachers jumped into the mock city to stop the rogue robot. They all stood in front of the building Izuku was launched into, and they took their fighting stances to go up against the robot, but before they rushed towards it, from the fallen debris in a building, a hand came out, then another, and Izuku started to lift himself out, but Izuku wasn't looking like himself. Due to being put in a near-death state, Izuku started to unlock his true potential, something a quirk could never beat, breaking his limiter. Izuku rose from the rubble, and with darkness shrouding his body, similar to the image in the thumbnail, Izuku dashed at the robot, jumping, mimicking the scene from the cannon, and he jumped up and punched the robot right in its face, sending it falling back into buildings. And everyone was watching. The heroes, the students, and people from the observation room were stunned by this unknown power Izuku just had all of a sudden. Izuku landed on the ground, and the heroes tried going up to him to ask like what was that, but Izuku wasn't talking and began walking out, blood dripping from his arm. So Izuku stopped at Uraraka and held out his hand, and at first she was scared, but held his hand and he picked her up and started to walk to the exit. So he brought her to one of Recovery Girl's robots, and he starts to head home. And while he's walking out of the building, all these people are giving him strange looks, but Izuku just wants to get home. So when he does make it, as soon as he shuts the door, he collapses on the ground. And Inko, who was cooking, was frightened and quickly brought Izuku to the couch, where she started applying all sorts of medicines to aid in his recovery. So she left him there to rest, and a couple hours later, Izuku wakes up. And seeing this, Inko was expectedly, happy to see her son that was okay. But then she started berating him, saying he almost gave her a heart attack and he should be more careful, things like that. And Izuku just scratched the back of his head and apologizes. So the next few weeks, Izuku spends doing light training. He doesn't want to, be lazy and kick about waiting for UA to send him his letter. But finally, after 3 weeks of waiting, he gets it. And Inko is excited. She runs into his room and says, "It's here, it's here." And Izuku is saying, he just woke up. He's like, "What now?" So Inko, knowing how little Izuku would care, she opens the letter for him, and from it, she took out a disc. She places it on the table, and a hologram of All Might appeared. He explains how well Izuku did on the exam, saying he almost beat his record of 300 by getting 280 points. And it ends off saying, "Welcome to your hero academia." Inko was more excited than Izuku, and she proposed they had a fun night out. So reluctantly, Izuku is dragged around to a restaurant and a place to play arcade games, which Inko is actually a huge fan of. So another week passes, and it's time for Izuku's first day at UA. So when Izuku gets to school, he actually has no problem finding the class since he read the handbook with the different location of classes in there. So when he walks in, everyone starts growing quiet because those who were in the same test area as he was in the entrance exams were starting not to get scared but worried. Bakugo was confused why everyone was acting so weird, then saw Izuku walk past him to go to a seat next to the window. And Ida came up to Izuku and started asking him about his quirk and how he was able to one-punch the zero-pointer. Bakugo is sitting down and hears this, and he's thinking how much stronger did he get over the break, and grits his teeth in anger and frustration. Soon Uraraka comes to class and goes to Izuku just after seeing him to thank him for saving her. She honestly can't thank him enough. So they start getting a bit noisy, and that's when Aizawa came up from his sleeping bag saying he's their teacher and they should shut up before he expels them. Some students were going to object, but they just made it into UA and they're not trying to test their luck. So Aizawa goes on to tell them to put on their PE gear and meet him out at the field. So they do that, and once they get there, Aizawa asks Izuku to come up and throw the ball to demonstrate since he got the most points in the entrance exam. And Bakugo is like, "Most points?" And at this point, he's just livid. Bro is so mad. Like, he trained so much to beat Izuku, and it's like Izuku just went miles ahead of him. So he clenched his fist, like he's almost seeing red at this point. So Izuku goes up to the this circle on the ground, and Aizawa hands him the ball. And he just tells him to throw it using his quirk, and Izuku does and gets a respectable 450 meters. And while throwing it, Aizawa tried disabling his quirk, but nothing happened. he didn't sense him turning anything off. Maybe he has a mutant quirk of some kind, because there's no way he's quirkless, right? So they go on to do the other tests, and Izuku does above average, landing him in second place behind Todoroki. So after everything's said and done, Aizawa sends them back to class. And while changing, Ojiro is always trying to avoid eye contact with Izuku and keeping his distance. And Izuku sees this and intentionally comes closer to Ojiro just to annoy him, really. Like, Izuku has nothing better to do. So Izuku gets a good laugh out of it while Ojiro is over there sweating bullets and getting scared. So nothing much happens that day, so on to the next. In class, while Izuku is just looking out of the window, All Might busts through the door and says, "I am here." And everyone is excited, like, All Might's like, he's actually teaching a class at UA, so they were really excited to see him. But All Might manages to quiet everyone down and says, "Aizawa has left you all a test." And everyone's mood immediately changes, hearing the word test. So he instructs them to get their hero outfits and to meet him at Mock City A. So, for his hero suit, Izuku didn't have anything fancy, just dojo attire he would wear when he was training with Shifu. So Uraraka came out and she went to Izuku and asked him like how her outfit looked. And let's just say her outfit wasn't hiding anything. So Izuku went a bit red but controlled himself and said it looked good. Now in the observation room, All Might started picking teams at random, and Uraraka and Izuku get paired up against Bakugo and Ida. So All Might goes into more clarification about the rules of how to win, and just overall have a fun time, don't take it too seriously. So Bakugo and Ida go into the building to prepare their strategy, while Izuku and Uraraka do the same but outside. He tells her just to leave everything to him, and Uraraka insisted, but he was already going towards the building. So he rushed in and started going up the stairs while Uraraka followed behind trying to keep up, but that wasn't happening. So while walking through one of the corridors, Izuku heard something coming from the wall. So he put his ears against it and at the last moment realized it was Bakugo's quirk and jumped back before the wall explodes. Bakugo comes out angry and he runs at Izuku, who dodges all of his attacks, and Izuku counters with his martial arts expertise, flipping Bakugo off balance and standing over him. Bakugo's face tightened in anger and says, "I'm tired of being beneath you." And he uses his explosions to rotate himself, swiping Izuku's feet and getting onto his own feet. So Bakugo shouted as he pulled the pin on his gauntlet and said, "Die!" But from behind him, Uraraka jumps out and touches him, making him float into the air. The explosion still went off, but the shot missed Izuku, but the damage was still significant. Izuku coughed as the smoke cleared and Bakugo was still floating and Uraraka took cover. So he quickly ran over to her and said, "Let's go," leaving Bakugo to float. So they make it to the room with the bomb and Izuku just kicks the door down without thinking. And Ida, still playing the villain character, said, "So you decided to come at me head on? That will be your mistake." And he dashed to Izuku and grabbed him, but it was like he disappeared out of his arms. Izuku was actually behind Ida. That was only an after image, and Izuku ran to the bomb, touching it and winning it for the hero team. Izuku yawned, saying how boring this all was, so he decided to just get it over with and find someone else stronger to fight. Back in the observation room, All Might had everyone comment on the round, but Momo had the most to say, saying, "I think Izuku was the MVP. He tried taking down the threat quickly, and even though he was reckless at times, I think that's just due to all of us being hero students." And All Might couldn't have said it better himself and sent everyone back to class. Once they got changed, they were walking by class 1B and all the students were giving them disgusted looks. But everyone in class 1A knew they was just jealous of their class's prestige and just walked past without giving them their time of day. Apart from that, outside of classes, a few friendships started to form, like the whole group of Class 1A girls, Momo, Froppy, Jiro, you know the rest. They started getting to know each other more and more. At lunch that day, Izuku sat by himself, but Uraraka and Ida and Kirishima plopped down next to him, and he asked them why they were sitting next to him, and Uraraka answered, because they wanted to, and started chowing down on their lunch. And also I should mention, the lunch at UA, it's 5-star restaurant level. They got Gordon Ramsay back there calling people idiot sandwiches, but hey, at least the steak is cooked to perfection. On a real note though, the four started talking about their lives, mainly Kirishima, Ida, and Uraraka. Izuku just kept to himself. But while talking, the sirens began blaring and panic ensued. People rushed the emergency exit, but it was blocked by the hundreds of students trying to get through. But Izuku remained calm, and he looked outside the window and saw a few reporters inside the school and thought that may have been the cause of the sirens going off. So he showed Ida, and Ida takes care of it just like Canon, asking Uraraka to float him up, and he gets, above everyone to announce them to just look outside, like they're not in any danger. Plus, they got All Might and all these other insane heroes on campus, so I'm pretty sure anyone in their right minds would not attack the school. But to Izuku, something didn't feel right. A group of weak, quirked reporters breaking through UA security just didn't seem possible to him, and Izuku wasn't the only one thinking this, because Nezu was going back to his office and saw it completely trashed, with files all over the ground and things knocked over. Now he has to be on high alert for the future of UA because people have gained teacher and student information. So, the next day rolls around, and in class, Aizawa tells the students about the USJ. And of course, at first they thought, Universal Studios of Japan, but he quickly corrected them, saying it stands for Unforeseen Simulation Joint. Honestly, to me, that name sounds so trash. I feel like it's just a joint in the name. Come on, you could have thought of something way better. Anyways, everyone is actually excited. They start to do actual hero training, and they'd be saving people. So come the next day, and with all the students' parents' permissions, they're on their way to the USJ. On the bus ride there, all the students start getting along, and the girls start bringing up who they think has the best quirk. And they're debating, saying Bakugo has the most flashy, but Todoroki's is really cool, and they're starting to realize they don't really know what Izuku's quirk is. He seems really strong, and people who were in the mock city with him vouched that he was extremely strong. He took down a 0-pointer with a punch. And hearing this, some of the girls were impressed, and the guys were also impressed. Like, Izuku didn't really seem all that strong, or at least he did seem strong, but not enough to one-punch a 0-pointer. You would expect someone with a build like All Might to be able to do that. So the girls start going off, trying to rank each other, but eventually they reach the USJ. And Ida, being the class representative, he gets everyone off the bus in a proper manner, and they line up to go into the USJ. Once they enter the building, they are met with the Space Hero 13, and he goes over how their quirk can be used to kill if they don't train it enough, because you could be saving someone but end up killing them. It's a really serious matter. And while the speech is taking place, Uraraka is secretly fangirling over 13. She's our favorite hero, similar to Canon Deku with All Might. And once 13's speech is over, they start heading down the staircase to start their hero training. And while halfway down the staircase, the group starts to sense something bad, like something bad is going to happen. That feeling you would get. And once they did, they saw a bunch of purple portals started appearing all around the place, and from it, villains ready to attack. Seeing this, Aizawa immediately told 13 to take the kids back to UA, but once she took the kids to the top of the staircase, a massive portal blocked their way. While some students were panicking and scared, Izuku was smiling. He was happy. Finally, he can let loose and take care of some lowlifes in the process. Last time we left off with Izuku about to take care of some villains in the USJ. He took off from the rest of the students and 13 shouted for him to come back, but he was already gone. Izuku jumped down the massive staircase and landed perfectly. Aizawa seeing him rush down himself, but Izuku had already started fighting. 10 villains came rushing at Izuku, but he easily dodged their attacks, striking them over and over and over. One he punched right in the head, sending him up into the air. Another he kicked across the face, and another he punched right in the middle of his chest, sending him flying backwards. Izuku could feel the difference in his strength as he moved through the weaker villains, but that's when a villain with a muscular build ran at Izuku, and I'm talking like he looks like All Might almost, and his body started turning into stone similar to Kirishima. Izuku jumped back and said, I never thought I'd be using the old man's technique. And just like his old master Shifu, Izuku moved his hands in a snake-like motion, and the villains were captivated by the faint flowing water trailing, like following his hand. And in an instant, Izuku blitzed the villain, crushing his face and slamming it into the ground. Izuku was about to face another wave of villains, but that's when Aizawa approached and said, "Kid, I told you to stay with 13. Izuku laughed and said, "I couldn't have you having all the fun." And Aizawa sighed and said, "We'll just work together. You take the left, I take the right." And as the two tore through the villain's troop, Shigaraki watched on in anger. He's itching his neck and saying, "No, they're cheating. Kurogiri, bring out the Nomu." And back with 13 and the others, she's managed to keep everyone else from running off. But students like Bakugo, Ida, and Todoroki felt useless as they just sat there and watched. But then they realized a massive portal appearing. As Izuku knocked out the last villain, they saw it as well, and from the portal stepped out Nomu. Izuku and Aizawa stood side by side as this massive purple monster rushed them. Aizawa used his quirk to cancel Nomu's, and it slowed down significantly, so Izuku ran at it and hit the Nomu repeatedly with fast, heavy attacks, creating wounds all over its body. But when Aizawa couldn't hold it anymore, he blinked, and the Nomu's body regenerated in almost an instant, and grabbed Izuku by the face and flung him aside and rushed Aizawa. This fight went as good as canon, with Aizawa being destroyed by Nomu, his arms broken, and his face slammed repeatedly into the ground. Shigaraki walked up and started laughing. "You were so cool, Eraserhead, but look at you now." Aizawa smiled, and this pissed off Shigaraki and said, "What are you smiling about?" And he said, "You lose." Shigaraki said, "What? Nomu, finish him off." But then Izuku came back with vengeance, and he dashed at Shigaraki and punched him across the USJ. Nomu came off Aizawa trying to fight with Izuku, but he dodged all of its attacks because Nomu being so big, it was pretty slow. But then Izuku saw 13 coming down the staircase, and it was like it ticked in his brain. A whole plan started to develop. Izuku started trading blows with Nomu, going all out, and he puts his back into the last one and punches Nomu into the air. 13 rushes in and uses her black hole quirk to suck in Nomu, and this disintegrates it into dust. After the fight, Izuku and Aizawa were completely exhausted, and Shigaraki managed to escape with Kurogiri, and the class were finally able to call UA for assistance. So soon after, the police and other service workers arrived, and they arrested the downed villains and helped heal people like Aizawa who were severely injured. So yeah, after that, Aizawa was taken to the hospital to be treated. And back at UA, Nezu cursed himself. He should have known that was their first move. It seems so obvious now looking back. I mean, as I say, hindsight is 2020. So following these villain attacks, UA were bombarded with news reporters trying to get some sort of headline to figure out why UA was attacked, and because of this attack, would the sports festival not go on? And speaking of the sports festival, similar to canon, it would only be postponed to a short time in the future. And getting this news, the public was outraged. How can you keep sending these students to an unsafe school? And due to the worsened state of Aizawa in this, they have reason to believe that. But Nezu thought it through and thought this was the best decision. So while school had given break, the students were still on top of their training, especially Bakugo. He had to figure out more creative ways to use his quirk, mainly flight and maneuvering in the air for long periods of time. So with Izuku, a day before the sports festival, he was out training at Dagobah Beach, and he sensed someone sneaking up on him. Izuku gets into his fighting stance and says, "Come out!" And from behind the trash bins came Shifu. Izuku was confused but remained on guard. Shifu approached Izuku with his hands behind his back and said, "So, I've seen you made quite a name for yourself at UA." Izuku said, "So what? You came to finish the job?" Shifu laughed and said, No. Just promise me something." And Izuku said, "What?" And Shifu continued. He said, "Use your power for good. I taught you for years, so I know that you aren't the biggest fan of heroes, but strive to be better. Strive to be the best." And Izuku thought about this for a moment and looked back at Shifu and said, "Well, what if I became a villain?" And Shifu smiled and turned his back, and while walking off said, "I doubt that." Izuku went back to his training, but the words of Shifu kept coming up in his mind. So, after 3 weeks after the incident at the USJ, the students were at school ready for the sports festival. When Izuku walked into the arena, he was disgusted. All the cameras and people watching, they're glamorizing the true dangers heroes are put through on a daily basis. And he just keeps thinking this society is rotten. But Izuku keeps his head down and continues on. Midnight calls for the class president of Wane, and Ida went up. Ida being Ida, he gave some speech which half the words the crowd have never heard of and didn't understand, but he was respectful at least. So they weren't expecting Ida to go on this rant, but clapped nonetheless. So Midnight took back the mic and started to roll for the different courses that the students will be taking part in. And first was the race, second the cavalry battle, and third, of course, the 1v1 matchups. So Midnight instructed everyone to the cave entrance where the race will start, and the crowd started getting electrified and cheered for whoever were their personal favorites. So as President Mike started the race, Todoroki froze the ground, but Izuku wasn't caught in it at all because he was already out of the cave. He breezed past the one-pointers and was ready to cross the cannon. Meanwhile, Todoroki was trying to desperately catch up, but Bakugo was the most impressive. He wasn't even on the ground. His training paid off cause he was in the air boosting towards the finish line without much trouble. Izuku crossed the cannon and Bakugo pulled ahead, but his bones were starting to feel the effects of extended use. Izuku wasn't going to let himself lose and dug up a mine and threw it at Bakugo. On contact, it exploded, causing him to fall out of the sky and crash into even more mines. Using this, Izuku pulled ahead and he crossed the minefield and won it. So, after he was waiting there, soon Bakugo finished with a few scars all over his body and some scorch marks on his clothes. Then Todoroki soon after, then everyone else came in, like Kirishima and Mineta, that's my boy, he has to make it. So, for the second stage, it's the cavalry battle, and Izuku is given his 10 million point headband. And this is like putting a giant target on your body because now everybody is gunning for him. Izuku's team was quite lackluster because it was only him and Uraraka. He was holding her up, but I mean, that's really all he needs. Nobody wanted to team with him. They were either scared of him or just didn't like him as a person because of whatever reason. Mostly, it's because he's in Class 1A. You know, Class 1B people just don't like Class 1A. So, while the second stage of the sports festival is underway, Izuku is evading the entire time, which you'd think having a whole nother person would slow him down, but it just didn't affect him. And at this point, the heroes in the crowd were impressed by his pure agility, but they still needed more convincing about his strength. So while evading, Izuku ended up caught behind the stadium wall, and the students thought they finally caught him. But Izuku was the one laughing when he punched the ground and caused a miniature earthquake, throwing everyone off balance, and he got away. And even though Todoroki tried using his ice quirk, Izuku punched through it, and Bakugo tried flying at him, grabbing his headband, but Izuku was too quick, and he couldn't stay in the air for long. So eventually, Izuku and Uraraka won the second stage of the sports festival. And now they had a bit of time to rest up and eat for the 1v1 battles. Now, in the cafe, Izuku is eating with all his friends, or at least they would consider him their friends, but Izuku doesn't really see it that way. But anyways, he's eating in the cafeteria with Kirishima, Uraraka, and Ida, and you know, they're just talking about some random stuff, whatever you and your friends would be talking about. So they were about ready to go, and Izuku was walking out with Uraraka when she said abruptly, "Hey, Deku." And Izuku said, "Didn't I tell you not to call me that?" Uraraka said, "Well, I think it's a cute name." And Izuku sighed and said, "Whatever, what is it?" And Uraraka looked up to the ceiling and said, "Well, do you like anyone?" And Izuku raised an eyebrow and said, "Yeah, I guess my mom." And Uraraka sighed and said, "No, someone other than your family." Izuku thought again and said, "Well, then, no." And it was like an arrow just went straight through her heart, and Uraraka said, I see." And Izuku looked over to her and said, "Is something wrong?" And she assured him everything was fine. So Izuku went off to his first battle for the sports festival. And he's walking up to the fighting area when he sees a general course student, Shinso. And Shinso didn't look so happy. And before the match even started, he was talking all this smack about Izuku, saying, "Oh, he has such a great quirk, I bet he's some privileged kid," but Monoma couldn't be far from the truth. But Izuku remained silent because that's just his nature. And before Shinso could say any more, Midnight said, "Begin." Immediately Izuku rushed Shinso. He wasn't playing around. And Shinso soon realized that he was dissing the wrong person. Izuku ran and punched him in the gut, and with that alone sending Shinso flying out of the ring. The heroes in the stands were impressed by Izuku's speed and strength. Like, this kid doesn't play around. That's what they're looking for in their hero agency. So after that upset, well, it's not really an upset, most people were rooting for Izuku in the first place. So after his match, it was Todoroki versus Setoro, and we all know how this one went. Todoroki going berserk and lancing a massive glacier at Setoro, almost killing him, to be honest. So after that match was Ibara versus Kaminari, and Ibara wins. Then Mei and Ida. Ida wins because Mei, all she wanted to do was just to show off her babies. Next was Mina versus Aoyama. Mina takes the W. Tokoyami versus Momo. Tokoyami comes out of it the winner. And we all know the draw. Tetsu and Kirishima. These guys have literally the same quirk, bruh. But yeah. Then this match, honestly, like, I found it hard to watch this one. Bakugo versus Ochako. And I mean, yeah, he was just being respectful and fighting her at full strength, but damn, bro, you could have at least went a little bit, not that hard. So now, between the first round and the quarterfinals was the tiebreaker for Kirishima and Tetsu, and Kirishima comes out with the win. Now, this was a fight that most of the crowd was anticipating. Izuku versus Todoroki. And when these two came up on stage, everyone was screaming, they were excited to see who was the stronger of the two, because Todoroki's quirk is incredible and Izuku just has a shroud of mystery around him. He obviously is strong, but to what extent? So the two approach each other and Midnight starts the match, and immediately Todoroki starts throwing spikes of glaciers at Izuku, but with a punch he breaks them. And this just keeps going on, similar to canon, where every glacier that Todoroki sends at Izuku, he just breaks with a punch. And soon his body would start getting frosted over because he's not utilizing his fire side, so his body is freezing. And Izuku uses this weakness to rush in and blindside Todoroki, punching him across the face. Todoroki regained his footing and looked at Izuku with a determination to win. And Izuku smiled and thought, now it's time for the real fight. Izuku ran at Todoroki, who had taken some time to heat his body up, and began his assault of ice attacks once again. Izuku jumped over them and started flying towards Todoroki, not literally flying, just moving really fast. And Izuku threw a punch at Todoroki, but he created an ice wall. But this didn't stop Izuku. He broke right through it and punched Todoroki across the face, and he fell over and rolled on the ground. He recovered, but Izuku was in the air and landed in front of him and started using his martial arts techniques. Todoroki tried using the little he knew, but it was no use. Izuku kept the heat on and pressing Todoroki until he was at the edge of the arena. An Endeavor in the stand shouted, "Don't you dare lose, Shoto!" And just hearing his voice pissed Todoroki off. His anger ignited his fire side, and the flames burned a bright yellow red. Yellow, but Izuku smiled and said, "Come at me." Todoroki, out of rage, combined both his sides into one attack, Ice Blaze, and Izuku's eyes widened as all he could do was watch the attack fire at him. The crowd gasped and steam filled the air. Everyone was worried and anxious what happened to Izuku, but when it became more visible, Izuku was still standing, with his shirt burnt off and third-degree burns in some places and frostbites in others. Todoroki gasped at how badly he injured his teammate, and he was shocked, traumatized by his own attack. And Midnight was going to stop the match, but Izuku held his hand up and said, "Todoroki, the difference between me and you is I don't quit." And Izuku disappeared from his vision, appearing behind him, and punched Todoroki in the back. Now imagine Lee when he was bullying Gaara. Naruto kept showing up behind him, in front of him, punching him again and again and again, until he knocked him out of the ring. And the crowd was absolutely stunned. Izuku is incredible. This kid, is he even human? How can he fight with all those injuries? People had so many questions about Izuku's quirk, and him in general. So the medical bots took Todoroki and Izuku away, and many feared that he wouldn't recover in time for his next match. But to be honest, that wouldn't really matter, because that fight alone had shown what Izuku was capable of, and many had sent Izuku letters to go to their agency. So Izuku was taken to Recovery Girl to recover, while the other fights went underway, bringing Ida, Tokoyami, and Bakugo to the semi-finals. When it was time for Izuku versus Ida, he wasn't showing up, and Midnight was going to call the match, but Ida insisted on giving him 5 more minutes. She accepted, and after 3, the man, the myth, the legend, Izuku was walking out like nothing happened to him. Back in Recovery Girl's office, she went to check up on Izuku, but he was gone. She panicked because the last time she saw him, he was a mess. But Izuku's regenerative abilities came in clutch, and he walked up to face Ida, and the crowd was electric. Ida said, "You can thank me later," and Izuku smirked, and as the match started, he said, "Well, how about now?" And as expected, Izuku took Ida down with relative ease. His speed was nothing to worry about as Izuku can go even faster. So after that match, it was Bakugo versus Tokayami, and as we know, Bakugo takes the dub on that one. Now it was time for the long-awaited finale, Bakugo versus Izuku. So we left off with Izuku about to face off against Bakugo in the Sports Festival Finals. Izuku wouldn't hold back, he ran at Bakugo at full speed, and Bakugo knew he wouldn't be able to keep up. So he set off a massive explosion in front of him, and while he was waiting for the smoke to clear, Izuku used this time to run behind Bakugo. His enhanced eyesight allowed him to see clearly in the smoke environment, and he ran up behind Bakugo, and before kicking him, he said, "You need to be more aware of your surroundings." But as Izuku's foot was inches away from Bakugo's back, it started to spark, like sparks were coming off of it, and then a massive explosion was set off, sending Izuku flying back. He managed to land on his feet and was confused, like what just happened, but Bakugo had a quirk awakening. His quirk got a boost. Now he can set off explosion from really anywhere on his body. Izuku looked at Bakugo, who was as confused as he was, so he rushed at him again. Izuku dodged all of his explosions, then got in close, uppercutting Bakugo, and he got knocked back. The shock of the explosion on his back from earlier was still hurting his bones. So Izuku knew Bakugo's quirk would be a problem now with his awakening of sorts, so he threw him as hard as he could outside of the ring, but Bakugo used this explosion to save himself. Izuku looked at Bakugo and said, "You're annoying, you know that?" Bakugo became smug and said, "I've always been stronger than you, you weakling." And hearing that word weakling resurfaced some memories of Izuku's childhood, the bullying he had to endure, the death of his father. Izuku said, "Shut up before I make you." Bakugo laughed and said, "Or else what?" Izuku became angry and ran straight to Bakugo, who said, "You're so predictable." And he shot an explosion, then turned around to expect Izuku's rare attack, but nothing. Izuku had run straight through the explosion and kicked Bakugo in the lower spine, pushing him out of the ring. Midnight raised their hands and said, "Izuku Midoriya, winner!" And the crowd cheered. Everyone was so amazed by the fights today, they were just impressed. So Bakugo was taken to the infirmary where Recovery Girl, she took care of him. And after that, All Might had the medal ceremony. Izuku obviously came first, Bakugo second, and Tokayami third. So just like canon, All Might went, and as he gave each of them their medals, he gave them some advice. Well, for Izuku, he couldn't really say much. Izuku just really needed to work on his approachability. Not every civilian out there thinks of him as a true hero. So that's really all Izuku has to work on. But his power and, foresight in battle is almost unmatched. So Izuku walks back to class with his gold medal around his neck, and while he's walking, he sees Uraraka, and she's excited and runs up to Izuku, congratulating him on the win. Izuku just brushed it off, not being that hard, and Uraraka punched him on the shoulder and said, "Stop being so modest, you did really well out there." Izuku sort of blushed, and Uraraka saw this and her eyes widened in disbelief. Mr. Tough Guy blush? Ain't no way. So she pretends like she saw nothing, and they continue to the changing room where they get into more casual clothes, and once they go to leave the school, they're both going their separate ways. When Izuku turned around and said, "Hey, my mom's probably going to have some celebration since I won. You want to come over?" And Uraraka without hesitation said yes. So the two agreed to 5 p.m. that evening. Izuku got home and he didn't even have time to say hello before Inko tackled him and lifted him off the ground, something Izuku didn't even know his mom could do. Inko placed him down and said, "You were incredible, Izuku." He scratched the back of his head and said, "Really, you think so?" Now it was like Inko reverted back to a child. She said, "Yeah, you were like whoosh and boom and pew 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 pew." She was just really excited, to say the least, and as expected, she had a whole night of partying planned. And this is when Izuku brought up a girl he asked to, come with them. And Inko is in her head like, a girl. Finally, I thought I was never gonna be a grandmother. And she turned to Izuku and said, really? Well, I only had 2 tickets for an amusement park, so, she can take mine. And Izuku questioned if she was sure, but Inko said, go have a fun time, with a sly smirk. So when it came time, Uraraka arrived and wow. She was wearing a beautiful dress and had a small purse. Izuku's jaw dropped, and Uraraka chuckled and used her hand to close his mouth and said, let's go. Eventually, Izuku snapped out of his daze and followed. So that evening, the two had an amazing night really. They went on ride after ride and Uraraka was the one forcing Izuku on the taller rides. You'd think after all his training that it would prepare him, but Izuku has actually never just had fun. He's been strict his whole time, always serious, but when you're like that, you don't get to experience life to the fullest and maybe die with regrets of a better life that you could have had. But let me not get so deep, but Izuku was just having an incredible time with Uraraka, and the two shared an ice cream sundae. They sat by the beach and watched the sunset. Then after they had a pretty fun evening, Izuku walked Uraraka home, and they were both laughing the whole way there, something Izuku was surprised he was even capable of doing. Remember, this is the guy who breaks bones on purpose, the guy who ties his hands and legs together and throws himself into an ocean. So Izuku brought her up to her door and they both wished each other good night, and Uraraka leaned in and gave Izuku a peck on the cheek, cementing that night as really the best night of his life. So the next day at school, we see everyone in class and Aizawa walks in. He gets settled and brings up all the hero agency offers per student, and expectedly Izuku had the highest with 5,000 offers. It could have been higher, but no one can deny the villainous aura Izuku gives off sometimes. Definitely not one of the first people you'd want to see when you're in distress, that's for sure. So after all the announcements, Aizawa gives the students time to think about who they want to intern with. Uraraka walks up to Izuku and asks him, since he has so many offers, it would be kind of hard choosing a hero agency. And well, she was right. Izuku didn't really have anyone in mind, and he was really and truly just gonna go train on his own or something. But Uraraka urged him to choose one or she'll choose for him. And that didn't seem like a bad idea for Izuku, so he didn't mind. He said, sure, go ahead. So of course Uraraka chose Gunhead, since that's where she was gonna intern in the first place. So those internships went pretty average. Izuku just spent most of his time chilling with Uraraka since he didn't have much to learn from Gunhead. But Uraraka was a different story. Like Canon, she does learn different takedown techniques, and with Izuku there as well, he showed her some of the basic martial arts he's learned. And after 2 weeks they've been at Gunhead, Uraraka is a pretty capable fighter actually. So after this, they start doing their usual hero patrols, and Izuku is in his hero outfit, which if you don't remember is just his martial arts gi, or sort of what you would wear when doing martial arts. And after 3 hours of patrolling, the streets have been pretty silent. Izuku, Uraraka, and Gunhead decided the next day to patrol one city over. Gunhead wants the two to experience a real villain attack, and they're going to Hosu City, known for its petty thieves. So the trio take the train there, and out of nowhere, a Nomu breaks through the roof of the train and reaches in, grabbing Gunhead. It was so quick the two couldn't even try to help him. Izuku acted quickly though and said, "Uraraka, float me." She does, and he grabs onto one of the poles in the train and jumps off it. Now he's basically flying towards the Nomu. Izuku caught up and punched the Nomu, knocking Gunhead out of its hands, and he fell, but at the last minute, Uraraka was there to save him with her quirk. She also released Izuku from her quirk's effect. Now, the three were standing on top of the moving train. Izuku looked at Hosu City and dark, thick smoke clouds were rising from it. They knew something bad was happening. In the city, Nomu were going around destroying buildings and posing a serious threat to human life. Heroes like Kamui Woods and Endeavor were on scene evacuating people and fighting Nomu as they come. Izuku, Uraraka, and Gunhead arrive at Hosu City still atop the train, so they hop down and Izuku tells Uraraka to find someplace safe for Gunhead and meet him at the tallest building, and he pointed to it. So Izuku runs off into the city, and as he's running, he thinks about a conversation he had with Ida the day of the medal ceremony. He realized how standoffish Ida was being, and when he decided to approach him, he overheard him talking about his brother's injury, and the next day Izuku heard about it on the news. At that time, Izuku didn't think too much about it, but the more he does, the more he realizes Ida might possibly want to take revenge. So Izuku kept that in the back of his mind for now, and he ran deeper into the city where he came across different types of Nomu and some hero even, saving people on the way, and those people actually recognized him from the sports festival and were grateful. So Izuku is taking the quickest way around the city, and this is by, hopping from building to building. And from atop of one of the buildings, Izuku sees some steam rising, and he was curious, what it was. So he went to check it out, and when he did, he was not expecting what he saw. He looked over the edge and looked down into the alleyway and saw Native and Ida being attacked by Stain. He saw Stain holding one of his swords to Ida's neck, and Izuku, acting quickly, jumps down and kicks Stain into the side of a dumpster. Izuku turns to Ida and says, for a smart student, you're pretty dumb. But Ida wasn't hearing any of it. Izuku didn't really care either, so he throws him over his shoulder, and Stain eventually gets up from the dumpster, and this time he's gotten a good look at Izuku and said, "Wait, you're a villain, why are you helping these heroes?" And Izuku was wearing his hair like how Garous does in the anime. So Izuku ruffles his hair down and looked more like he did in the sports festival, and that's when a light bulb clicked for Stain. He said, "Oh, it's you. I've been meaning to fight you, And Izuku said to Stain, "I'll take you down too, but I don't have time today." With Ida over his shoulder, he grabbed Native by the back of the shirt and jumped off. Stain was just dumbfounded by how little this kid cared. Izuku would go on to take the two to a nearby hospital, and the entire time Ida is telling Izuku to put him down, yada yada yada, even though he's paralyzed. But Izuku really couldn't care less about Ida's injured brother, because when someone is in danger, it's his job to help them. So after his visit to the hospital, he went to meet Uraraka at the planned spot, and for the rest of the night, the two helped out as best they could, actually outperforming some experienced heroes. But soon enough, all the Nomu were captured or defeated, all the while Shigaraki watched in delight. After that night, the police taped off almost the entire city and opened an investigation on the cause of the attacks with the help of higher-ups at the Hero Agency. So to Shigaraki at his hideout. He was sitting down when All For One came on the television screen, and he said, "Did you manage to take down the green-haired boy?" And Shigaraki puts his head down and said, "No, master." All For One was visibly angry and he slammed his fist onto his chair. He sighed and said, "I give you tens of Nomu and you still fail? I guess sometimes you have to just do it yourself." And the feed to the TV cuts off. All For One gets up out of his chair and a muddy portal appears in front of him, and he walked through it. And now standing on top of a building, he thinks, Now where is All Might's successor? I should mention Izuku is not All Might's successor, he just thinks he is. So Izuku is out with Uraraka actually, and the two are eating at a nice restaurant when an explosion was heard outside. The two quickly got up to check what it was while everyone else in the store was screaming in panic. Izuku started looking around for where it came from, then suddenly he got knocked into the road from behind him like a gust of wind hit him, and Uraraka turned around to see, who it was, and a tall man pointed his hands towards her. Then another gust of wind shot her outside of the store. Izuku got up and turned to face the man, but he was gone. All For One then grabbed Izuku by the head from behind him and slammed him into the ground. And All For One was tired of One For All, these damn successors. He's gonna make sure he gets rid of it this time, and starts stomping out Izuku. The people watching in horror just froze, not knowing what to do. But the flame hero Endeavor arrives, and he sends a prominent burn at All For One. He used his wind gust against it to blow it away, and with Izuku lying in a pool of his own blood, All For One turned his attention to the number 2 hero. Endeavor was outmatched to say the least. All For One's quirk served to aid him in the fight, and he had a water quirk from the 2 firefighter heroes that Muscular killed, and that worked as a counter to Endeavor's flames, actually weakening him once he got his whole body soaked. Now Endeavor was basking in his new reign as an ultimate villain. With One For All finally gone, he can now reign supreme. Then from out of nowhere, All For One got punched in the side of the face, deforming it more than All Might's punch did, and it sent him flying into the side of a building. Izuku was now fully in his monstrous state. His senses were heightened and Izuku was ready to kill. All For One got up, but Izuku was like he was teleporting, that's how fast he was moving, appeared behind All For One and used both his hands to slam down onto his head and punched him again. All For One could not react. He didn't expect this from a kid, and now he was at death's doorstep. And Izuku said, "See you in hell," and punched him in the head once more, and it smashed like a watermelon. Izuku was breathing heavily and began to calm down, and the severity of his injuries hit him with a wave of pain, and he collapsed as well. Heroes and emergency services came on scene within like a minute, taking Uraraka, Izuku, and Endeavor to the hospital to recover. Luckily, they were all alive, and in the hospital, after three weeks, Izuku regained consciousness, and almost immediately he felt someone jump onto him. Uraraka was waiting the whole time, and Izuku's groans of pain, made Uraraka realize, she shouldn't have jumped the gun. So she got off of him and said, "Finally, Sleeping Beauty's awake." Izuku couldn't not smile, and he said to Uraraka, "I'm just glad to have you." Now, the My Hero story would progress completely differently from what we know it. With All For One gone, Izuku as well as All Might and Endeavor, just some top heroes, would go around and just taking down some of the major villain rings like the Shie Saikai and the rest of the LOV, because without All For One they didn't really have much leadership. And eventually you'd see Izuku climb the ranks as a hero and become Japan's new symbol of peace. And that is where I'm going to be leaving this one off. Thank you guys for sticking around to the end of the video. If you liked it, like. If you like my content in general, subscribe. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next What If.